The sun glared through the oval windows, highlighting the packed, cramped economy cabin. A single father, Elias, dressed in a faded jacket, sat by the window, his son, Leo, clutching a worn backpack beside him. Up front, a known CEO, Victoria Thorne, was complaining in business class. She turned, her dismissive gaze sweeping the cheaper seats, finally landing on Elias and Leo. A cold, cutting remark echoed down the aisle. Some people really shouldn't bring kids on flights like this. Leo lowered his head. Elias gently squeezed his son's hand. Suddenly, the cockpit chime sounded, sharp and urgent, slicing through manufactured calm. The man was Elias Vance. To the airline, he was Seat 28A. To the world, he was utterly invisible. He was a single father, 41 years old, defined entirely by a self-imposed monastic discipline. His posture was ramrod straight, a habit deeply ingrained from a life once lived in environments where precision meant survival. Elias had been Major Elias Razor Vance, a decorated F-18 instructor pilot whose combat flight logs and tactical development records were sealed under military classification. Now, that precision was used only for schedule management, packing lunch, navigating school drop-offs, and ensuring his son, Leo, 7, never felt the chaos Elias had consciously purged from their lives. He had exchanged the vast, boundless sky for the meticulously tiled floors of a quiet life. He had spent 2 decades in a world of high-G turns and supersonic decisions, a world that measured success in microseconds and survival by instinct. The sacrifice was absolute, giving up a salary that could have secured their future for the predictability that secured Leo's daily peace. The anonymity of Seat 28A was the armor he now wore. This flight was a deviation, but a necessary one. It was a required trip for a consulting job, the first in months, and a promised trip to see the ocean for Leo, whose deep, imaginative mind needed the scope of the sea to feel truly free. Elias had promised him a successful trip, and a promise to Elias was a covenant. Leo was a quiet child, keenly observant and painfully aware. He was accustomed to the hushed tones of adults, the subtle shift in atmosphere when people realized Elias was alone with him. He was a master of stillness, instinctively minimizing his presence to avoid disrupting the delicate, fast-paced world around him. Leo kept his eyes on his worn, character-themed backpack, which contained his 2 most precious items, a well-loved sketchbook and a small, slightly scuffed model jet fighter, a gift from his father. In the first row of business class, behind the curtain, sat Victoria Thorne. At 38, she was the CEO of a revolutionary tech logistics firm, a figure of aggressive ambition and calculated impatience. She managed a staff of thousands and controlled capital flows worth billions. She was accustomed to priority boarding, customized service, in a world that bent effortlessly to her schedule and demands. This commercial flight, delayed and crowded, was a violation of her expectations, a symbol of the mediocrity she worked constantly to escape. Victoria's mind operated on a binary system, value or inefficiency. Her gaze, when it stopped on Elias and Leo, was not one of malice, but of categorization, a rapid, contemptuous appraisal rooted in social stratification. She saw the slightly frayed collar of Elias's jacket, the cheap backpack, and the child's silent, awkward posture, and instantly filed them under inconvenience. Her primary irritation was that their mere presence diluted the exclusive experience she had paid for. Her cutting remark was not truly aimed at them. It was aimed at the system that forced her to share airspace with those she deemed inferior. The brief sentence hung in the air. Some people really shouldn't bring kids on flights like this. It was a small act of violence, a verbal gesture that successfully soured the air around Elias and Leo. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. After all, she was the CEO, and they were the nameless crowd. Elias did not react externally. He tightened his grip on Leo's small hand, a muscle movement so minute only Leo would feel it. The public humiliation, the casual cruelty, burned him not for himself, but for his son. It was the injustice of the civilian world, a world where the quiet dignity of sacrifice was overlooked for the loud entitlement of wealth. Leo finally spoke, his voice a tiny, wounded whisper that only Elias could hear over the drone of the engines. "Did we do something wrong, Ba?" Elias looked down at the top of his son's head. His disciplined code demanded absolute truth, but his father's heart demanded protection. He did not immediately answer. Instead, he simply pressed his thumb firmly against the back of Leo's hand. It was an unspoken lesson, a silent communication that Elias had drilled into him. Hold the line. Pause. Observe. Ensure you are absolutely right before you act or speak. It was a doctrine of his past life, now the core of his parenting philosophy. Be silent until you are ready to be undeniable. The aircraft pulled away from the gate. Elias stared out the window, his expression impassive, the noise of the taxiing jet providing a necessary shield for his sudden internal turmoil. He was locked in place, the familiar discipline holding the rage in check. He just needed to get through this flight. The flight climbed and finally leveled out at cruise altitude. The initial hustle of the cabin staff settled into a steady rhythm of drink service. The economy cabin, temporarily forgetting the CEO's slight, gradually settled into the expected soporific peace of long-haul travel. The air quality, however, felt stale and slightly humid, a minor technical sign that Elias's subconscious registered instantly. Leo, however, remained subdued. He kept his head bent low over his sketchbook, occasionally glancing up, his eyes darting quickly around the cabin, avoiding direct contact with anyone. He was still processing the unspoken accusation that he was an unwelcome burden. In the forward cabin, Victoria Thorne continued her low-level campaign of complaint. She was using the Wi-Fi, trying to manage a billion-dollar deal, and was continually irritated by the intermittent service and the constant noise leakage from the economy cabin. She flagged down a flight attendant, offering another, louder, slightly more pointed remark about the dilution of the travel experience for those who paid for premium service. Her words, once again, drifted clearly over the dividing line, a low-frequency hum of judgment directed generally at the lesser travelers. Elias kept his gaze fixed on the expanse of cloud below, a white, endless sea that seemed to mock the confined, petty drama of the cabin. He had trained himself to tune out all unnecessary noise and visual distractions, a high-level cognitive function essential for his former job. He focused on the only things that mattered: Leo's steady breathing and the low, predictable drone of the twin jet engines. Then he felt it. It wasn't a sudden jolt, nor the heavy, lurching sensation of clear air turbulence. It was far more subtle, a deep-seated, unusual oscillation that felt completely wrong. The plane was already at cruising speed, having completed its climb. The normal vibrations of the airframe, the characteristic buzz of metal against wind, should have been entirely predictable, a constant, low-level tactile signature. This new vibration was different. It was a high-frequency shudder, almost imperceptible to the average passenger, yet instantly recognizable to someone who had logged thousands of hours intimately connected to the mechanics of high-performance flight. It felt like a subtle, systemic imbalance, a rhythmic pulse coming from deep within the airframe. The rhythmic hum was now layered with a faint metallic whine that peaked and dipped with the throttle setting, a sign of harmonic resonance building up, likely due to a minor failure in an engine component, or, more critically, the primary hydraulic fluid lines passing through the wing assembly. Elias subtly shifted his weight in the seat. He moved his hand from Leo's to rest it lightly on the plastic armrest, pressing down, trying to triangulate the source through the composite materials. The shudder was persistent, not intermittent. It was not turbulence. It felt metallic, rotational, and dangerously unnatural. He quietly checked the condensation patterns on the window glass. They were vibrating at an irregular frequency. He recalled every lesson, every emergency checklist, every simulator failure drill. His brain immediately began running diagnostics based on the input he was receiving from his hand, his ears, and the slight unnerving tremor in the coffee cup of the passenger next to him. Hypothesis 3. Hydraulics or flight control surface flutter. Now that was concerning. This specific high-frequency whine was often a precursor to a pressure drop in a non-redundant system. A short technical announcement from the flight deck confirmed his fears. although masked in technical jargon. We have noted a mild instrument discrepancy on the port side. Our systems are compensating. Compensating. Elias instantly translated, "We have lost partial control authority on the left side, and the computer is fighting to keep us level." He felt a surge of cold dread, the kind that had saved his life during 9 different combat sorties. The control surfaces were likely experiencing actuator degradation. The plane then dropped perhaps 20 feet. A clean, sickening lurch that felt mechanical, not environmental. A few passengers gasped. The tension in the cabin spiked. Elias, trapped in his economy seat, felt a profound internal conflict. His code of conduct demanded that he immediately communicate the severity of the flaw, which he could diagnose better than the commercial autopilot. Yet his new life demanded silence, anonymity, and the commitment to remain just Ba to Leo. He could not reveal the razor. To intervene would mean sacrificing his hard-won peace. He focused intently on the sound and the feel. The vibration continued, a quiet, deadly metronome ticking beneath the polished veneer of the commercial flight. It was the moment before everything broke loose, the last few precious seconds before the situation went beyond the point of no return. Elias could feel the entire world tightening around him, but he was trapped. A pilot, trained to command, now confined to a narrow economy seat, unable to warn, unable to act. All he could do was wait for the undeniable sign that would shock the complacent world outside his discipline. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The moment of quiet tension shattered without warning. A harsh, triple-tone chime, not the normal chime for service, but a high-priority alarm sounded throughout the cabin. Immediately, the fastened seatbelt signs illuminated, and the cabin lights flickered, not once, but twice. The plane pitched violently, a movement sharper and more abrupt than the typical turbulence. The airframe groaned audibly, a sound of stressed metal that silenced the entire cabin. The flight attendants, who minutes ago were collecting service trays, exchanged rapid, anxious glances. Their smiles vanished. They began moving quickly down the aisles, their voices calm but firm, urging passengers to secure their belongings and return to their seats. Their practiced serenity was suddenly replaced by a genuine tension that quickly spread through the plane. An announcement followed, a short, pre-recorded technical statement that did little to reassure the now murmuring passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We are currently experiencing an unexpected fluctuation in airframe stability. We are working with operations control to resolve this immediately. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The subsequent silence from the flight deck was deafening. No further calm words, no confident reassurances. Just the strained silence of 2 men fighting a machine in real time. Elias knew that silence meant the pilots had their hands full. The plane was now descending rapidly, not smoothly, but with a chaotic, corkscrew motion that pitched passengers sideways against their restraints. The systemic imbalance was growing worse, forcing the pilots to attempt to lose altitude, a last-ditch effort to reduce aerodynamic loads, but the controls were clearly sluggish. Leo, his face pale, gripped his father's arm tightly. "Ba, what's happening?" Elias looked at his son, his eyes clear and steady. "The machine is sick, buddy, but the pilots are working on it." He locked his gaze on the ceiling. His mind calculated the remaining time they had before structural or hydraulic failure was inevitable. The high-frequency whine was now a grating screech. A moment of agonizing, stretched-out quiet followed. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, adding to the fearful atmosphere. People were praying, weeping, and shouting into their phones, trying to send final messages before communications were inevitably cut off. Then came twist 1, the fateful call. The internal chime rang again, a single, long, authoritative blast. The subsequent voice was not the captain's calm, rehearsed tone, but a different voice, deeper, strained, and filled with a desperate professional urgency. This was not a pre-recorded statement. This was a man speaking live, fighting for his life and the lives of 200 others. His voice cracked with the sheer effort of keeping the plane level. "This is the captain. Attention, cabin crew and passengers. We are in a critical situation with the primary flight controls. Our first officer has been incapacitated due to a sudden medical event, and I require immediate assistance in maintaining manual control. I need someone with very specific advanced training. The air in the cabin died. The panicked shouts ceased instantly, replaced by a vacuum of sound. Every head, all 200 of them, turned, swiveling simultaneously, searching for a face, a uniform, a sign of hope. The question was an absurdity, an echo from a war movie. Fighter pilots? The specificity was terrifying. The captain needed someone whose muscle memory was trained for high stress, pure manual, and unconventional flight envelope recovery. Then the captain's voice returned, the question hanging in the air, a plea born of utter desperation and final, terrifying necessity. The words were clear, impossible, and undeniable. Are there any fighter pilots on board? Victoria Thorne, the CEO, sitting in business class, had been frozen, her phone half raised. Her expression was no longer one of professional annoyance, but of raw animal terror. She stared wide-eyed at the floor, expecting an air marshal, a uniformed savior, anyone to emerge from the chaos. Then came Twist 2, the man who stood up. In the quiet, unremarkable economy cabin, seat 28A, the seat of the father who had just been publicly slighted, finally moved. Elias Vance slowly reached down, his hands moving with the practiced, deliberate calm of a man who had faced death 1,000 times. He unlatched his seatbelt. The small metallic click of the buckle sounded like a gunshot in the silence, drawing every eye in the entire economy cabin. He stood up, slowly, deliberately, the movement of a man shedding his disguise. For years he had worn the cloak of fatherhood and civilian obscurity. Now the uniform of duty snapped back into place. His faded jacket suddenly looked like the flight gear of an operator. He was not wearing a uniform. He wore only a faded jacket and the tired expression of a father, but his posture was that of a commander. He leaned over the aisle passenger, his voice perfectly steady, addressing the nearest flight attendant with an economy of language that only a true expert would use. My name is Elias Vance, former major, call sign Razor. I have the necessary flight hours and tactical airframes. Tell the captain I'm coming. He did not wait for a response. He moved into the aisle. His pace was not rushed, but every step was purposeful, efficient, and direct. He was walking toward the only place where his immense, carefully concealed skill could be used, the fire. Leo looked up at his father, his eyes wide and stunned, seeing a stranger in his father's clothes, a man who was not merely but something vast and powerful. The small boy's lips trembled as he watched the quiet, invisible man who had just been mocked become the only answer to the cabin's collective prayer. Victoria Thorne, who had been sitting mere feet away, saw the man from seat 28A walk past her. She saw the calm focus in his eyes, the absolute lack of panic. Her mind raced. This is not possible. This is the man The ridicule died instantly on her lips, replaced by a horrified, chilling realization. No one laughed now. The CEO, who had built her life on judging human value, was staring at the undeniable truth. She had just spit on the only man who could save her. Elias Vance disappeared beyond the business class curtain, ushered forward by the flight attendant with an expression of stunned reverence. The curtain swung shut, isolating him in the realm of decision and danger. The economy cabin remained paralyzed, silent, and breathless. The shock of the captain's call was only now being processed, replaced by the profound, terrifying realization that their fate rested entirely on the quiet man in the faded jacket. Inside the cockpit, the struggle was immediate and brutal. Elias didn't need introductions. He took in the incapacitated first officer, the captain, a civilian veteran named Miller, sweating heavily, wrestling a yoke that had gone nearly dead, and the flashing red console lights that screamed, hydraulic primary loss. Elias didn't touch the controls at first. He leaned in, speaking only in military brevity. Razor, Major Vance. Control loss verified. Give me the yoke and verbalize your current input. Measure. He spent 20 seconds diagnosing the commercial jet's response, translating its heavy, slow commands into the intuitive, immediate physics of a fighter jet. When he finally took over, his hands were steady, making micro-corrections the fatigued captain couldn't manage. They weren't flying the plane. They were wrestling a dying piece of metal, using pure aerodynamic knowledge to keep it from spiraling. Victoria Thorne sat utterly motionless in her plush seat. Her mental processing had ceased. The insult she had delivered hours ago now felt like a curse, a grotesque cosmic joke aimed squarely at her own arrogance. She watched the curtain, unable to process the dichotomy. The man she had dismissed as a public nuisance, an unwanted intrusion, was now their sole line of defense against gravity and mechanical failure. Her highly paid, powerful credentials meant nothing here. Her life, too, was in the hands of the janitor of the sky. He brought a child on the flight. He wasn't even supposed to be here, her mind screamed, a terrible irony. Leo in seat 28A sat bolt upright. He did not cry or panic. He held his small model jet fighter tighter, his eyes fixed on the gap where the curtain met the wall. He was witnessing his father shed his disguise, reverting to the hero he once was. The fear was still there, but it was now laced with a confusing, overwhelming pride. Time stretched, thick and suffocating. Every passing minute felt like an hour. The plane continued its unsteady descent, the shuddering persisting, though perhaps less violently than before. Inside the cockpit, Elias was using differential thrust, the ability to control the massive airship using only the two engines, a technique usually reserved for emergency military protocol. Finally, an announcement. Not the captain and not Elias. It was a new voice, clear, calm, and utterly professional. The voice of the senior flight attendant, who was now monitoring communications and serving as the temporary first officer. Ladies and gentlemen, we have stabilized the immediate control issue. We are continuing our emergency descent to a nearby alternate airport. Please remain seated. We are now in a controlled state, the controlled state. That single phrase was the only evidence they needed. It meant the civilian pilot, working alongside the military pilot, had managed to contain the crisis. Relief did not explode in cheers or applause. The emotional release was far deeper, more internal, and more terrifying than that. It manifested as deep, shuddering breaths, silent tears, and the quiet, almost painful slackening of tensed muscles. No one celebrated. They simply understood, in the most primal sense, that they had been spared. Victoria Thorne slowly lowered her head. She did not raise her eyes again, not even to check the status of her business class companion. Her entire identity, her foundation of judgment and superiority, had been annihilated by the quiet competence of the man she had humiliated. She had judged a book by its cover, and that cover had just saved her life. The original prejudice no longer held any ground. The air was thick with a new, collective sense of humility and gratitude. A full hour later, the plane landed. Not smoothly, it was a heavy, slightly lurching landing, but safe. The cabin remained silent until the aircraft came to a complete stop. As the emergency services raced toward the plane outside, the cabin door was finally open. Elias Vance was the last person to emerge from the cockpit. His face was streaked with sweat, his eyes tired but focused, his faded jacket slightly rumpled. He did not seek attention. He simply walked back down the aisle, slipping back into his anonymity. He reached Seat 28A. Leo looked up at him, his small face a mask of awe and confusion. You're a pilot? Leo asked softly. The question more a statement of disbelief than inquiry. Elias sat down, buckling his seatbelt. He placed a steadying hand on Leo's knee. I was, buddy, he confirmed, his voice low and firm. A long time ago. Now I'm just your ba. Before Elias could unbuckle his son, Victoria Thorne stood up. She waited until the immediate rush of emergency personnel had passed, and then she walked slowly to his row. All eyes were on her. The CEO, stripped of her context, was suddenly just a woman. She did not offer a business card, a contract, or any form of monetary compensation. She simply stood before Elias and Leo, her spine straight, her tone devoid of all artifice and condescension. Mr. Vance, she began, her voice cracking slightly, I owe you my life, and that of everyone else here. My behavior earlier was unforgivable. It was arrogant, cruel, and profoundly ignorant. I apologize without excuse. She paused, her voice shaking slightly, the weight of her previous words finally crushing her corporate composure. I saw only a seat number and a cheap jacket. I didn't see the man. I didn't see the skill. I am truly sorry. She looked down at Leo. And I apologize to you, young man. Your father is a true hero. She did not seek a response. She simply nodded once, a gesture of respect stripped of all pretense of rank, and walked toward the exit. No one paid attention to her expensive suit or her title now. They only saw a fellow passenger who had been wrong and was now humbled. Elias watched her go, a quiet validation in his eyes. The evacuation began, orderly and subdued. Elias and Leo stepped out with the crowd, the two of them walking away from the dramatic, life-altering experience. As they walked down the tarmac toward the makeshift terminal, Elias looked down at his son. "The seat doesn't define the person, Leo," Elias whispered, a final lesson that had just been proven on a global scale. Humility is always more important than altitude. The most capable person in the world is often the one you choose to ignore. They merged with the grateful, silent crowd, the former fighter pilot and his son, disappearing back into the safety of their quiet, disciplined life on the ground. The final message: true value does not require a challenge to be proven, only the humility to be seen. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Respect often arrives quietly, but it lasts.